On the early morning of the 26th of March, 2015, the quiet suburb of Kingsville in the state of Ohio looked as usual. Well-maintained lawns, a peaceful street, and neighbors occupied with their everyday affairs. None of the residents of Willow Street suspected that house number 18 would soon become the center of a sensational investigation. Around 6:30 in the morning, a police car drove to the house of John Andrews, a reserved, middle-aged man. From the outside, the house looked completely normal, a well-maintained lawn, a neat path to the door. The police officers made no noise and decided to manage without unnecessary attention from neighbors. After a brief exchange of sentences, the officers calmly went to the door. John Andrews was known among neighbors as a quiet and reserved person who never caused problems. Only one thing seemed strange. About a year ago, he began making unusual gifts to his neighbors. Kangaroo meat, which according to his statements was brought by a relative from Australia. The residents received this with interest, although no one had seen evidence of the existence of such a relative. But exactly this strange meat became the reason why police stood at his front door. The night before, a search group dealing with the disappearance of 34-year-old Ellen Craig had discovered blood-stained clothing of the missing man. The clothing was found in a nearby garbage container, and experts quickly determined that the fiber traces on the fabric matched those used in carpet coverings of inexpensive houses from the early 2000s. Exactly this led police to house number 18. The neighbor, elderly Evelyn Carter, suddenly remembered another important detail. A few days before Craig's disappearance, she had seen John Andrews hurriedly carrying something wrapped in tarpaulin into his garage. This detail, which previously seemed insignificant, now took on a sinister undertone. At this point, police already had information about the unpleasant smell coming from John's house. But at that time, the complaints were attributed to ordinary problems with the sewage system. The homeowner who opened the door seemed surprisingly calm and even offered the police officers water. Inside, everything was clean and orderly. No disorder, nothing suspicious. But the calm of the atmosphere disappeared when one of the officers looked into the inner courtyard. There, next to the garage, stood cooling containers that were locked with massive locks. This clearly did not fit into the overall picture. After opening the containers, police discovered strange plastic containers with stickers K-Roo that supposedly indicated kangaroo meat. Only the appearance of the product did not inspire confidence in the experts. The meat resembled neither kangaroo nor beef or pork. Suspicion grew with every minute. The door to the basement aroused particular interest from police. Massive locks and additional bolts from the inside did not at all fit an ordinary home workshop. Andrews assured that there were only tools there and nothing interesting could be found, but his composure was disturbing. After long attempts, the door could be opened and the police officers went down. The basement proved to be narrow and poorly lit. It seemed as if no one had been here for a long time, but in the corner were found plastic packages whose contents immediately aroused the interest of experts. They were brought upstairs, and although it was not said aloud what exactly was found there, the atmosphere around the house became increasingly tense. Andrews himself, who remained with the police officers, answered questions briefly and unclearly. He could not understandably explain where he got the kangaroo meat, naming neither relatives nor companies or other suppliers. It turned out that he had no connection to Australia, and the whole story appeared at least suspicious. At this point, the officers had already noticed the disappearance of Julia Andrews, John's wife, who had not appeared in the house for a long time and had not made contact. This added additional questions and complicated the investigation. Police continued the search until late evening and took samples for expertise. Soon journalists and curious neighbors gathered around the house, to whom the authorities only briefly reported that it was a standard check within the framework of investigations into Alan Craig's disappearance. However, this only intensified rumors and unrest among residents. The next morning, investigations were already continued in expanded composition and attracted new experts. The police officers prepared for inspection of the garage and hoped to find at least some clues about the missing Craig and possibly other mysterious disappearances that had occurred periodically in the city in recent years. At that time, the residents of Kingsville did not yet know that the name John Andrews would soon be at the center of the most shocking case in the history of their small suburb. And the truth about the strange gifts he distributed to neighbors would prove to be much more frightening than all assumptions. After police officers completed the morning inspection of the house at 18 Willow Street, investigators gradually began to create a chain of events to understand what had happened to Alan Craig and to solve the mystery of the so-called kangaroo meat. John Andrews, the homeowner, had been living here for more than 10 years and had always been a quiet and inconspicuous person. Neighbors hardly knew him, except that they noticed the strange delicacies he sometimes distributed. Police initially dealt with searching for documents related to the import of the unusual meat, but as it turned out, nothing of the kind was recorded in any register. The laboratory began examining the meat samples found at Andrews. However, results were not expected earlier than the next day. While waiting for experts, investigators decided to check John's contacts. His telephone bills were quite boring, a few work calls and rare conversations with his wife, Julia. Alan Craig's disappearance continued to cause concern. Relatives claimed he would never disappear without warning, and at the warehouse where Alan worked, they confirmed they had last seen him on the 21st of March. Exactly at this time, his telephone sent its last signal near John's house. Additional concern for police was aroused by the fact that in the last 5 years, there had already been several unexplained disappearances in Kingsville. These cases were not investigated in detail because police suspected that people had simply moved away from the city. Now, it was decided to recheck everything to exclude a possible connection with Andrews. Neighbor Evelyn Carter added an interesting detail. She often saw John loading strange packages into his car at night. At that time, she attached no importance to this and thought the man simply worked at night. Later, however, it turned out that he had no night work schedule. Other neighbors also remembered the unpleasant smell near the garage and connected it with the said meat, but no one turned to police. Investigators also found out that John began treating neighbors with kangaroo meat about 3 to 4 years ago. He spoke of a cousin from Australia, but no one had ever seen proof of such connections. Moreover, the packaging looked homemade and did not resemble official deliveries. Officers meanwhile continued examining Andrew's basement. There they found cutting tools that the owner described as for his hobby. However, the traces on the equipment looked suspicious, and experts took them for analysis. Chief Commissioner Robert Moore requested additional forces from the district. It was decided to check databases to find out whether similar cases had occurred in neighboring cities. Details about the whereabouts of Andrew's wife also remained a mystery. Police had not yet received confirmation that Julia was actually on a business trip. The residents of the district were puzzled why the inspection extended over the entire day, but the police had to proceed carefully, as the case no longer looked like an ordinary disappearance. The media began to pick up the story and hinted at possible smuggling of exotic meat or even human remains. The experts promised first analysis results already the next morning. The police understood that the situation could change quickly. If it turned out that the meat did not come from an animal, the case would take a completely different turn. In parallel, the investigators checked local hospitals and morgues to ensure that there were no other strange cases. So far, nothing was found, but concern was growing. In the evening, a closed consultation took place with criminologists and representatives of the prosecutor's office. Two main versions were discussed. Either it was a violation of hygiene regulations, or the case concerned a much more serious crime, possibly murder. The friends of the Andrews family described John as a quiet and harmless person. Some even admitted that they had tried his delicacies and noticed nothing strange apart from an unusual taste. The police could only wait for the results of the laboratory tests. Everything appeared extremely confusing. A missing person, strange meat, a quiet and mysterious homeowner. It was exactly from such details that a disturbing puzzle formed, which troubled the entire city. At the end of the day, there was no direct evidence against John, and officially he remained at liberty. However, the police observed him closely and prepared for the next phase of the investigation. Everything depended on the results of the examination, which could completely turn the case around and confirm the darkest assumptions. John Andrews had lived quietly for about 10 years in a small suburb of Kingsville on Willow Street, house number 18. He settled here in the year 2005 and apparently did not stand out particularly from the locals. He once operated a small business for repairing household appliances, but closed it for unknown reasons. In the tax documents appeared modest income from private orders, no debts, or problems with the law were registered in his name. John never got into conflict with the neighbors, and not even complaints about him were received. With him in the house was registered his wife Julia, although the locals practically never saw her. She worked somewhere outside of Kingsville, but nobody really knew the details. In recent months, she was not seen in the city at all, and even the police could not immediately find out where she was located. No official reports about her disappearance were received, but her absence added an additional puzzle to the events. Alan Craig, a 34-year-old man, had recently moved to Kingsville to take a job at the building materials warehouse. He was a responsible, orderly person who always maintained contact with relatives. But on the 21st of March, Alan suddenly stopped getting in touch, which was completely atypical for him. His sister quickly contacted the police, and the investigations began. The police established quite quickly that Alan had called a handyman to repair household appliances shortly before his disappearance. A neighbor confirmed that he had seen a man with tools at his place. Later, it turned out that it was John Andrews, with whom Alan had actually made contact on the day of his disappearance. Craig's phone sent a signal for the last time exactly in the area of Andrews' house. As for Julia Andrews, her acquaintances claimed that she had previously worked in one of the factories in the neighboring district and was still officially listed there. But why she had stopped coming home, nobody could explain. The last time she was seen was in December of the previous year. The police did not yet know where she was staying, whether she had moved, or whether something else had happened. Among John's neighbors, an elderly woman named Evelyn Carter, who lived across the street, stood out particularly. She was the one who told the police about the exotic kangaroo meat that John often offered to the neighbors. Everyone perceived it as a nice quirk. Nobody asked unnecessary questions, but it turned out that exactly Evelyn had seen Alan on the evening of the 20th of March near John's house. Later, she noticed Andrew's car with an open trunk, but she did not see Alan himself anymore. Many locals remembered that John regularly brought large packages home and mentioned a relative from Australia. Nobody had seen any documents or evidence for the existence of such a relative, but until recently, there were also no doubts. Alan's phones, bills, and work environment were also checked. The warehouse management told the police that he always informed about changes in his schedule, and his sudden disappearance appeared extremely suspicious. In his apartment, everything looked orderly, as if he had only gone out briefly and wanted to return. The investigators checked Alan's acquaintances and colleagues, but found nothing unusual in their behavior or their alibis. The landlord also confirmed that Alan had no conflicts and always paid on time. The special attention of the police was directed to the Andrews family, more precisely to their absence. How long had it been since Julia had appeared at home? Where is she now? There was no reliable data, and the investigators began to collect all clues that could clarify the situation. Furthermore, the police began to be interested in possible guests of John. Neighbors told that he was a rather closed person, rarely invited anyone, but from time to time held small barbecues where he prepared unusual meat that was allegedly delivered to him exclusively. Loud events were never noticed at his place, thus three figures stood at the center of attention: the homeowner John Andrews, the missing Alan Craig, and the mysterious Julia, whom nobody had seen for a long time. Other cases of disappearance in the city also emerged, which previously aroused no suspicion but now became part of this big question. The investigations were conducted simultaneously in several directions. It was necessary to find out what had happened to Alan, where the strange meat came from, and to understand what was actually going on in John Andrews' house. The investigators' greatest hope were the results of the examinations, which could uncover the truth and confirm or refute the worst version of the events. In investigating the life of John Andrews, his family circumstances, and the mysterious disappearance of Alan Craig, the police encountered a tangled puzzle. The officers searched telephone records, financial documents, and listened carefully to the neighbors. But the picture did not result in a unified and logical story. Some suspected that everything began with a simple domestic dispute. Others insisted on a more serious criminal secret. The investigators formulated several versions, and each seemed logical only up to a certain point. Nobody could clearly answer the main question: what happened to Alan, and why were there so many disturbing finds near John's house? The first version on which the police officers concentrated was connected with the smuggling of exotic meat. Many officers suspected that John possibly operated an illegal business with the delivery of rare products, and Alan might have accidentally learned about it. The found containers with unusual marking confirmed the suspicions, but the police officers could not find a single document that confirmed the import of such products. There were neither customs declarations nor records of business dealings with John. Bank statements and telephone calls also yielded no clues, so the version about smuggling remained unconvincing, although they did not rush to discard it. Another hypothesis connected Alan's disappearance with a series of similar cases in the district in recent years. Several people disappeared without apparent reasons, and the police suspected that Craig might have become part of a larger story. The disappeared persons were newcomers or single, and although no direct connection to John was found, the investigators wondered, perhaps something terrible is hiding behind the quiet life on Willow Street. But without evidence, this theory also remained at the level of assumptions. The third version assumed a domestic conflict between John and Alan. Possibly there was an argument about money or personal matters. The containers with kangaroo meat could, in the opinion of some investigators, only be a means to divert police attention. But Alan's friends and colleagues remembered no conflicts or financial problems. Andrew's house looked clean and well maintained. No obvious traces of a fight were found, and Alan's quick disappearance did not fit with an ordinary domestic dispute. The fourth hypothesis, kidnapping for blackmail, also looked doubtful. None of Alan's relatives received any threats, and the family's bank accounts did not change. If it was a kidnapping, someone would probably have already contacted the relatives and demanded ransom, but nothing of the sort happened. The investigators even considered the possibility that Alan himself had decided to disappear and staged this event. But here too there were problems. He had no serious debts or difficult personal circumstances, and he left his personal belongings in his apartment in perfect order. Friends said he was planning to stay in the city for a long time. Therefore, a voluntary departure seemed unlikely. The sixth version concerned the personality of John Andrews himself. Possibly he was hiding serious problems or even a mental disorder, but neither a neighbor nor the district official familiar with John noticed anything strange in his behavior. Even during the search, he behaved completely calmly and showed no aggressive traits. The most disturbing version, which the police spoke about quietly and cautiously, was that the kangaroo meat might not be kangaroo meat at all. Possibly it was human remains. The experts were waiting for the results of the analysis without drawing premature conclusions. But the absence of documents for the meat, the mysterious labeling, and the dubious connections to Australia aroused serious suspicions in the police. All these contradictions and the lack of direct evidence forced the investigators to proceed cautiously. Waiting for the results of the investigation was agonizing because it depended on them which version had to be investigated first. The team of criminalists tried to find witnesses and study the surveillance camera recordings, hoping to see something unusual on the night when Alan disappeared. So far, the case appeared like a tangled puzzle, at the center of which stood John Andrews, his long-absent wife Julia, and the suddenly disappeared Alan Craig. The police understood that haste could harm the investigation, so they decided to observe John closely, without taking hasty steps. The city filled with disturbing rumors. People waited for the experts' statements and feared the worst. Many already began to cautiously discuss the darkest hypothesis, hoping that it would never be confirmed. In the initial phase, the investigation could not accurately understand John Andrews' role in the mysterious disappearance of Alan Craig. The investigators thought through various scenarios, from ordinary fraud to strange smuggling of exotic meat, and tried to explain the mysterious containers labeled K-Roo. But soon, something happened that turned the entire case upside down. On the 2nd of April, the results from the district laboratory shocked even the most experienced staff. It turned out that the mysterious kangaroo meat was not an exotic product at all. The experts officially confirmed the found samples did not come from animals, but from humans. The report clearly established that human tissue was discovered among the found fragments, and its origin left no doubt. Also disturbing was that the human remains belonged to several people simultaneously. When the investigators received this data, a frightening picture finally came together in their heads. All versions about minor conflicts or random incidents immediately fell away. Alan Craig's disappearance was now directly connected with the contents of John Andrews' freezers. Furthermore, when comparing the samples with the missing persons database, it could be confirmed that part of the remains belonged to Alan himself. This was the key evidence that led the police to recognize the case as murder.
John Andrews immediately changed from the category of merely a suspicious person to the main suspect of a cruel crime. The memories of John's strange behavior during the search took on a completely different meaning. Now both the locks on the cellar doors and the bloodstains on the tools were seen as direct evidence that something terrible had happened in the house. The police received permission for the urgent arrest of Andrews and an additional thorough search of his house. While the investigators prepared the arrest warrant, the experts continued to analyze other found samples. It turned out that among the fragments were the remains of at least 2 other people, besides Alan Craig. According to preliminary data, it was a man and a woman of middle age, but exact matches with other missing persons had not yet been found. The investigators began to review the archives of mysterious disappearance cases of recent years in the district. Unexpectedly, many details that had previously been given no significance began to paint a disturbing picture. Andrews' nocturnal trips, strange packages, conversations about unusual meat, all this now appeared as part of a terrible scheme. On the morning of the 3rd of April, the investigators came to John's house to arrest him. Andrews offered no resistance and calmly repeated that a mistake had happened and he was innocent. However, the police no longer had any doubts about his involvement. John was taken to the station for questioning, and the house on Willow Street was subjected to a new, more thorough inspection.
During the extended search, another refrigerator was found that had not been opened before. In it, they also discovered packages labeled K-Roo, and next to them lay a personal object that presumably belonged to one of the victims. The experts immediately sent the find for additional analysis, as they suspected it might be an object belonging to Julia Andrews, the suspect's long disappeared wife. At this moment, it became finally clear that the case was much more serious than initially assumed. Everyday versions and minor conflicts disappeared from the investigation's view. Now it was about a possible serial murder. The investigators began to examine all of John's contacts, his correspondence, and internet search history in detail, hoping to find traces of other possible victims. Meanwhile, the fate of Julia Andrews remained unclear. Her last documents and contacts were discovered more than half a year ago, and the neighbors had not seen her in the city for a long time. The police did not rule out that the female remains might belong to her, but additional tests were required for confirmation. The task forces understood that the case had taken a sharp turn and could become one of the most sensational in the district's history. They expected new discoveries that might emerge after investigating all the details of John Andrews' life. The city was slowly gripped by unrest, and although the authorities had not yet officially communicated all the details, rumors about the terrible find were already beginning to spread among the residents. The investigation entered a new phase, And now the police's main task was not only to understand the motive of the crimes, but also to uncover all the details of the terrible secret that was hidden behind the walls of the quiet house on Willow Street. When the police received confirmation that the remains of Alan Craig and at least 2 other people were found in the discovered freezer containers, the quiet life of the small town was finally transformed into a nightmare. The investigators understood that now every inch of John Andrews' house had to be examined with special care. Forensic teams dealt with different parts of the house. Some inspected the basement, others checked the garage and the attic. Soon, special dismemberment tables were found in the basement, on which biological traces of various people were discovered. The experts immediately took samples for further examination and concluded that the room had been actively used for exactly such horrible purposes over several years. The tools found there also seemed strange. Knives with special sharpening, surgical scalpels, and an unusual saw that was clearly not intended for household use. The technical inspection of the ventilation showed that a powerful odor extraction system was installed in the house, obviously designed specifically to hide traces. The experts found remains of disinfectants and even biological particles in the sewage pipes, which confirmed the police's terrible suspicions. A separate group of specialists dealt with John's computers and technology. Although part of the files had been deleted, the investigators managed to restore correspondence and the history of search queries. It turned out that Andrews researched how to eliminate biological traces and how to preserve meat for a long time. Particularly disturbing were his information searches about human anatomy. These discoveries showed that the crimes were carefully planned in advance. The police began looking for connections between John and other missing persons. They remembered migrants and seasonal workers who disappeared without a trace in Kingsville. Previously, no one had connected these cases with each other, but now the theory emerged that Andrews selected victims who had no close relatives or friends in the city. During interrogations, John categorically denied his guilt. He claimed that the containers had been purchased already filled, and he allegedly had not known what exactly was in them. But the statements of neighbors and the absence of purchase receipts spoke against this. Neighbors saw how John himself unloaded the containers in the yard, which completely destroyed his story. The verification of Andrews' financial transactions revealed no signs of a large business or smuggling, but periodic small money transfers remained a mystery. The investigators concluded that he acted independently and very cautiously. In Andrews' garage, the police discovered a cabinet in which foreign personal items were stored, documents, photos, and clothing pieces. It looked like a collection of personal items of the victims. These items were also sent for examination to find out to whom they belonged. The witness Evelyn Carter and other neighbors reported that John often drove out late in the evening and loaded strange bags into his car. Such trips usually coincided with the time when temporary workers appeared in the city. Now the police suspected that he lured these people with offers for temporary work or repairs. The investigation dealt separately with the fate of Julia Andrews, John's wife, whom no one had seen for a long time. No transactions had been made from her accounts for a long time, and the phone was switched off. The theory emerged that one of the discovered female DNA might belong to her, but there was no final confirmation yet. The police carefully examined the data written on the packages with the inscription K.Ru. Many dates coincided with missing person reports, which strengthened the conviction that these were serial acts. To establish all circumstances and possible victims, a special cross-district group was formed. They checked the disappearance of people outside Kingsville, where John might have traveled professionally. The task forces collected all possible evidence and checked GPS data and financial transactions. The investigations promised to be lengthy and complex. Each found fragment required a separate genetic examination. The police prepared for an extensive procedure and understood that this case could become one of the most sensational in the district's history. So far, only reserved comments from the police reached the media. The residents were not told details to avoid panic, but rumors had already spread, and the city gradually sank into an atmosphere of fear and distrust. The investigators were sure of one thing: John Andrews was not simply a murderer, but a serial killer who proceeded carefully and calculatingly. Now the main task was to find answers to questions that would disturb the residents of Kingsville for a long time. When the police received confirmation, that among the remains found in John Andrews' house were parts of Alan Craig and at least 2 other people, the entire investigation picture changed drastically. The investigators decided to examine every piece of evidence extremely thoroughly to understand the full extent of what was happening in the quiet house on Willow Street. They created a detailed table into which they entered literally every find, witness statements, and examination results. Thus, patterns began to emerge that previously seemed to be only strange coincidences. Particularly important was understanding how long Andrews might actually have been committing his acts. Neighbors remembered that John brought strange large packages home every few months. These dates coincided with encrypted entries on his computer. At the same time, seasonal workers and loners disappeared in the city, whose disappearance no one had previously paid special attention to. The police paid special attention to the disappearance of Julia, John's wife. For a long time, it was assumed that she had simply moved away, but after analyzing the evidence, it turned out that she had stopped appearing at work and maintaining contact with relatives about half a year before her husband's arrest. Traces of female DNA were found in the basement of the house, which raised suspicion that Julia might also have become a victim. The laboratory checked these materials, and the investigators waited with special impatience for the results. Additional and disturbing data came after examining John's electronic correspondence. In it, they found letters in which he offered friends and acquaintances to try exotic meat, allegedly imported from Australia. It was still unclear whether his conversation partners knew the true origin of the delicacy. These contacts were placed under observation, although the police had found no direct evidence of mass trade in human flesh. Another disturbing discovery were old receipts and vouchers from Andrews' former repair service. It turned out that several customers to whom he had provided repair services were reported missing. No one had previously connected these cases with John's name, since many of the missing were outsiders and had no close relatives in the city. The investigators particularly noticed the absence of evidence pointing to the presence of accomplices. All found records and evidence indicated that Andrews acted alone. His own notes and annotations were found on his computer, which resembled a personal diary. In it, he recorded dates and even kept a detailed account of his actions. No mentions were found of other people who would have helped him. At the same time, the investigators tried to reconstruct how John lured his victims. Possibly he used different approaches. To outsiders, he might have offered temporary work. To locals, repair services. The house and basement were always closed from foreign eyes, and no one suspected what was actually hidden behind the quiet life of an ordinary repairman. All this data gradually came together to form a complete picture. The investigations convinced themselves that John proceeded methodically and carefully selected his victims. He not only killed but dismembered the people in his basement, using special tools and equipment. The remains were stored in containers labeled Karoo, as if they were ordinary meat products. John's motives remained puzzling. He made no money from it. His financial accounts showed no large income. Possibly it was about a psychological motive. Andrews himself answered evasively during interrogations, denied the murders, and claimed everything was a big mistake. Soon, the police discovered several more cases of missing persons that could be connected to Andrews. These people disappeared in time periods that matched the entries in his computer. All these materials were now carefully examined and checked in the laboratory. The investigations moved to a new level. The prosecutor's office opened a separate case against John Andrews for the murder of at least 3 people. Unofficially, people began to speak of serial crimes. While waiting for further laboratory results, the police no longer doubted John's guilt, although many questions remained open. Primarily, this concerned the extent of the crimes and the number of victims. The investigators were convinced that Andrews had acted for a long time and thoughtfully, avoiding any unnecessary attention. The case was now at a stage where the investigators were collecting the last puzzle pieces. Every fragment found, Every detail could shed light on another terrible secret that was hidden behind the silent walls of John Andrews' house. The most important thing remained to find out. Exactly how many people were affected by his actions, and what other secrets lay hidden in his past. After the investigators had collected all details and carefully analyzed every piece of evidence, the investigation officially entered the final phase. It became definitively clear how terrible and extensive John Andrews' crimes were. Experts were able to confirm the identity of 6 people whose remains were found in his house. Among the victims were people who had long been considered missing, as well as John's own wife, Julia Andrews. Laboratory examinations confirmed that the found remains completely matched the DNA of Alan Craig, several seasonal workers, and Julia. Julia's relatives provided materials that clearly proved her identity, and the terrible version of her disappearance was finally confirmed. Now, no one doubted anymore. The woman was killed about half a year before John's arrest. The investigators gradually reconstructed the crime pattern. It turned out that John lured the victims to his house by offering small repair services or temporary work. The people did not even suspect that they were walking into a trap from which they would never return. After the crimes, Andrews dismembered the bodies and carefully hid the remains in freezer containers labeled K-Rue. This was not just a method to cover tracks. It was a calculated and cruel strategy that the police now analyzed step by step. In spring 2015, John Andrews was officially charged with 6 counts of murder. He stubbornly denied his guilt and tried to convince the investigators and the court that everything had happened by chance. However, the investigation results left no doubt about his guilt. The motives for his actions remained puzzling. He received no money or other material benefit. Psychologists explained this only with pathological tendencies, and a psychiatric evaluation recognized him as completely mentally competent. In summer, the trial began, which attracted great attention from the press and residents. The families of the victims, journalists, and simply curious people followed every session. In the courtroom, the prosecutor presented comprehensive evidence, DNA analyses, personal belongings of the victims, and witness statements from neighbors. Particularly shocking were the stories about how John entertained neighbors and acquaintances with meat that he presented as an Australian delicacy. These details finally destroyed the defense's position.
Andrews himself spoke very reluctantly. He admitted that the bodies were indeed in his house, but denied premeditated murders. His lawyer tried to insist that John had acted under psychological pressure, but the results of psychiatric examinations spoke against this. The witness statements that parts of his wife's body were among the remains robbed the defense of any chance of success. After several weeks of deliberation, the jury announced their verdict. John Andrews was found guilty on all charges. The judge sentenced him to several life sentences without the possibility of early release. After the verdict was announced, the prosecutor's office stated that they would continue to check possible connections of Andrews to other missing persons, but the current list of victims already guaranteed that he would never be free again. After the trial, the investigation was officially closed, although the police continued to check additional theories and the disappearance of other people in the district. Some experts suspected that the actual number of victims could be higher than could be officially confirmed. Law enforcement agencies began to pay more attention to such disappearance cases in the future. The John Andrews case showed how easily a person can commit terrible crimes and still remain unnoticed by neighbors and acquaintances. After the trial, city authorities tightened control of craftsmen offering repair services and strengthened the screening of newcomers. Thus, one of the most sensational and shocking cases in the history of Kingsville found its conclusion. The city's residents finally received answers to their questions, and the family of Alan Craig, as well as other victims, experienced at least some justice. John Andrews was recognized as a serial killer who coldly committed his crimes over many years and was now forever deprived of the possibility to harm others. As the trial against John Andrews came to an end, the story that had shaken Kingsville seemed to be concluded. Shortly after the verdict was announced, however, the police received an unexpected call.
a neighbor from the other end of Willow Street reported that he had discovered a package labeled Crew in his freezer that he had received from Andrews many months ago. On the packaging was a date that matched the period of Alan Craig's disappearance. This call prompted the police to think again about the extent of the case. The investigation confirmed the worst fears. The package indeed contained human remains. The experts could not definitively determine whether these were the remains of Craig himself or whether they belonged to another victim, but the date on the packaging matched exactly with the period of his disappearance. The investigators considered, possibly there could be many more such packages. The police asked city residents to check their freezers, storage areas, and pantries, especially those who had previously received similar gifts from John. But the response was small. Some admitted to having long ago thrown away suspicious packages without suspecting anything, while others completely denied ever having accepted such gifts from Andrews. The investigation could not confirm whether there were other such cases, but established with certainty that at least one package with human remains was in the house of a person who knew nothing about its true contents. The question arose whether John had accomplices or people who unknowingly helped him distribute the delicacies. The investigators found no direct evidence that anyone intentionally helped Andrews hide the traces of his crimes. Most likely, people believed his legend of the relative from Australia and did not suspect what they were actually holding. The police could never fully clarify whether Andrews had accomplices or accidental witnesses. After John had already been sentenced to life imprisonment, the question of the actual extent of his crimes thus remained unresolved. How many such packages could still be stored in neighbors' houses, in garages and country houses? The police did not conduct mass inspections of residents since no further direct reports came in, but warned everyone that people should be attentive and report suspicious finds. Officially, the Andrews case was considered closed, but the investigators admitted that possibly not all victims were identified. The police did not rule out that someone might have accidentally or unknowingly helped in the distribution of human remains. However, since no new evidence emerged, the case experienced no further development. So this terrible story is formally ended. John Andrews serves his life sentence and no new charges were brought against him. Nevertheless, this disturbing discovery by the neighbor remained recorded in the investigation files, which served as a last reminder that the extent of the crimes could have been much greater than could be proven in court. The city continues to live with the feeling of incompleteness and hopes that there will be no more such surprises.